Most people believe defense attorneys exist to protect their clients at all costs. That's not true. We protect them within the law, and when the law goes silent, when it gives you no guidance at all, what you do next becomes a test of who you really are. Anthony was sitting beside me in court, hands-free for the first time in weeks, convinced this hearing was the turning point in his life. Judge Robinson was listening. The prosecutor was backing down. Everything was going exactly as planned. Then Anthony smiled and whispered one sentence. And in that moment, I realized my job wasn't to save him anymore. It was to control what happened next. Before we continue, I want you to drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from, and also make sure to subscribe so you won't miss out on more stories to come in the future. To understand why I made that decision, you need to understand the rule nobody ever explains to clients, and the moment it stopped protecting any of us. The rule is simple. Your lawyer isn't your friend. Your lawyer is your strategist, your translator, your buffer between chaos and consequence. But Anthony Reeves didn't want a strategist. He wanted someone who believed him. And God help me, I did. Anthony grew up in Canarsie, the kind of neighborhood where you either learned to fight or learned to run. He chose neither. He learned to talk his way through things, a skill that served him well until the night it didn't. He wasn't stupid, despite what the prosecution would later imply. He wasn't evil, despite what the victim's family would claim. He was reckless, the way men become when price costs less than backing down. The assault charge stemmed from a bar fight outside McCarthy's on 4th Avenue. Two men, too much whiskey, an argument about nothing that mattered. What started with words ended with Anthony holding a broken bottle and the other man holding his bleeding face. Witnesses said Anthony struck first. Anthony said he was defending himself. The bottle said he'd gone too far either way. The stakes were brutal and mundane all at once. Anthony worked as a union electrician, good pay, better benefits, the kind of job his father had held for 30 years before him. A felony conviction meant losing his license, losing his livelihood, losing the ability to look his mother in the eye when she asked what went wrong. He had a daughter, 7 years old, who drew pictures of them together in crayon. He couldn't explain prison to her in any color that made sense. When he sat across from me in the consultation room that first time, his hands wouldn't stop moving, drumming the table, adjusting his collar, gripping his knees. Fear wrapped in bravado, desperation disguised as confidence. He needed someone to tell him it would be okay. I told him I'd fight for him. What I learned watching him those first few weeks was that Anthony became dangerous only when people underestimated him, when they treated him like another thug with a record, another statistic waiting to happen. He trusted me completely because I didn't. I saw the electrician, the father, the son trying not to disappoint his family. He believed I was his shield. I knew shields could crack. The morning we walked into court for the preliminary hearing, Anthony wore the navy suit I'd insisted he buy. He straightened his tie 3 times before we reached the courthouse doors. His confidence had returned, solid and unshakable. "We got this, right?" he asked. I pulled open the heavy marble door, letting the weight of marble and judgment wash over us. "We got this," I lied. Judge Robinson had the kind of face that gave nothing away, carved from patience and procedure, weathered by 1,000 pleas and precedents. He surveyed his courtroom like a captain checking for leaks, his gaze settling on each of us in turn, the prosecutor, me, Anthony in his careful navy suit, the court officers flanking the doors. The prosecutor, Marcus Chen, rose with the weariness of a man reading from a script he'd memorized years ago. "Your Honor, the people oppose any modification of bail. The defendant used a deadly weapon in an unprovoked assault. He poses a clear danger to the community and a flight risk, given the serious nature of the charges." Predictable, recyclable, the same argument in 1,000 courtrooms for 1,000 different men. I stood, and the room shifted its attention like a spotlight finding its mark. Your Honor, Mr. Reeves has lived in Brooklyn his entire life. He's a union electrician. I slid his employment records across the bench with 12 years of continuous service. No gaps, no complaints. He has a 7-year-old daughter who depends on him and an aging mother in Canarsie who requires his support. I produced the documentation Marcus hadn't bothered to request: pay stubs, school records, a letter from Anthony's local parish priest. The prosecution calls this assault unprovoked, but their own witness statements contradict each other on who initiated contact. They reference a deadly weapon, a bottle that broke during the altercation, not one brought to the scene. Anthony has no prior violent offenses. He surrendered voluntarily. He's complied with every condition of his release. I watched Marcus's jaw tighten. He hadn't prepared for competence. Beside me, Anthony's shoulders began to drop from their defensive hunch. His fingers stopped their nervous percussion against his thigh. When I cited the procedural weakness in the arrest report, the arresting officer's failure to properly document the chain of custody of the bottle itself, Anthony almost smiled. Judge Robinson made a note, and that small gesture felt like victory breaking through the clouds. Bail is modified, Robinson said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Mr. Reeves may report weekly instead of daily. Electronic monitoring is removed pending trial. The gavels struck once. The sound should have been louder, should have echoed. Instead, it landed in silence, the kind that follows applause in an empty theater, the kind that feels like respect. The gallery, sparse as it was, remained still. Even the court officers seemed to nod their approval. Anthony turned to me, his eyes bright with relief that felt earned, deserved, real. "You saved me," he whispered. I gathered my files, snapped my briefcase closed, and let him believe it. Because at that moment, I believed it too. He was leaning against the wall near the court officer's station when we emerged from the courtroom, and everything about him was wrong, in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Too polished for someone waiting on a case. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored to precision, the kind of fit that whispered money without shouting it. His shoes caught the fluorescent light with a gleam that suggested recent professional shine. But it was his posture that struck me first. Too relaxed for someone in a courthouse, arms crossed loosely, one ankle over the other, as if he were waiting for a table at a restaurant rather than standing in the belly of the criminal justice system. He laughed at something one of the court officers said. The sound carried across the marble corridor with an ease that didn't match the acoustics. The officer, Rodriguez, I knew her, strict about procedure, unmoved by charm, laughed back. Not politely, genuinely. Davies. I didn't know his name yet, but I would learn it soon. He moved through the space with a familiarity that had no visible rank to explain it. Not a lawyer, I knew every defense attorney and prosecutor who worked these halls. Not a detective, they wore their authority differently, harder. Not a defendant, everything about him said he'd never stood on the wrong side of a bench in his life. The courthouse noise began to fade, the usual shuffling of papers, murmured consultations, and bailiff announcements compressing into background static. My focus narrowed, telescoping on this man who didn't belong. He caught my eye and smiled. Not the smile of recognition or greeting, something else, something that made my briefcase feel heavier in my hand. Anthony was saying something beside me, his voice bright with the adrenaline of victory, but I couldn't parse the words. My instincts, the ones that had kept me alive in courtrooms and consultation rooms, the ones that read danger in the spaces between what people said, were screaming that something was wrong. Davies pushed off the wall with the grace of someone who'd never had to explain himself to anyone. He nodded to Rodriguez, who nodded back like they were colleagues, like they shared something I wasn't privy to. Then he walked past us, close enough that I caught the scent of expensive cologne and something metallic underneath. He didn't look at Anthony, but Anthony watched him go, his celebrations stuttering to a halt. "Sarah," Anthony said, his voice dropping to something quieter, something cautious. He leaned closer, his shoulder nearly touching mine. That guy? Oh, I know that guy. Anthony's voice was barely audible, meant only for me, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water. The words themselves were nothing, casual, almost dismissive. The tone beneath them was everything. My pen froze halfway through citing my name in the case folder. My breath stayed steady. Years of courtroom discipline wouldn't let it waver. But my mind lurched into overdrive, cataloging every detail of the past 30 seconds. Davies' suit, his easy familiarity with the officers, the way he'd walked past us without acknowledgement but with awareness. "How do you know him?" I asked, though I had already assembled the answer myself. Anthony's eyes tracked Davies's retreating form down the corridor, past the security checkpoint, through the heavy doors that led to the street. Neighborhood stuff. Canarsie. McCarthy's. He paused, and I felt the weight of what was coming before he said it. But that ain't his name. And he ain't who he says he is. The courthouse sounds rushed back in the squeak of shoes on marble, the electronic chime of the metal detector, someone's phone buzzing insistently in a pocket. But all I could hear was the implication threading through Anthony's words like wire through a bomb. "How do you know him?" I asked, though I was already assembling the answer myself. "He was around, after the thing, at McCarthy's, asking questions. Said he was a friend of Tommy's, the guy Anthony stopped, reconsidered. But Tommy doesn't have friends who dress like that. And he knew things, details nobody talked about, except the people who were there." My mind clicked through the possibilities with mechanical precision. Not a witness, not a concerned citizen, not anyone who belonged in this equation unless undercover. The word arrived in my consciousness with absolute certainty. Davies wasn't watching Anthony's case. He was embedded in something larger, something that Anthony had stumbled into or near or through when that bottle broke outside McCarthy's. An operation that had taken months, maybe years to build. Networks of trust, carefully constructed identities, investigations that lived or died on anonymity. And Anthony had just recognized him in open court. Exposure didn't mean disciplinary action or a mistrial. Exposure meant Davies got found in a dumpster or the East River, his carefully constructed cover blown, his value to whatever organization he'd infiltrated reduced to zero. Exposure meant death, not the metaphorical kind lawyers trafficked in, not career death or reputation death, the literal kind, the permanent kind. I looked at Anthony, whose relief from 10 minutes ago had curdled into something resembling fear. "Don't," I said quietly. "Say that to anyone else." If Anthony talked casually, carelessly, in a bar or to a friend or to anyone who might repeat it, Davies died. Not might die, would die. People who compromised undercover operations didn't get reprimands or transfers. They disappeared in ways that looked accidental until you knew what to look for. If I warned, Davies tracked him down, broke attorney-client privilege, confirmed what Anthony suspected, and destroyed my career and possibly Anthony's case. Judges didn't forgive lawyers who traded client confidences for favors, even life-saving ones. The Bar Association would strip my license before I could finish explaining, and Davies might not even believe me. Worse, he might believe me and decide Anthony was too dangerous to leave walking around. If I did nothing, kept my head down, protected my client, and maintained the ethical boundaries I'd sworn to uphold, someone would still likely die. Either Davies, if Anthony's recognition spread through Canarsie like gossip always did, or Anthony, if whoever Davies was investigating decided to clean up loose ends. The calculation played out in my mind with the cold precision of case law. This wasn't about choosing right or wrong, it was about choosing damage. Loyalty to Anthony meant protecting him from consequences, even ones he hadn't created yet. It meant building walls around his words, his knowledge, his dangerous recognition of a man who couldn't afford to be recognized. But loyalty had a cost measured in someone else's blood. Warning Davies meant betraying everything I'd built my career on, the sanctity of the attorney-client relationship, the trust that kept defendants talking to their lawyers honestly. It meant crossing a line I'd never crossed, into territory where lawyers stopped being advocates and started playing God with information. Doing nothing meant abdicating responsibility entirely, letting chaos sort itself out, hoping Anthony kept his mouth shut and Davies stayed alive and somehow the universe balanced its own equations without my intervention. I felt my emotional detachment slide into place like armor, the same detachment that let me defend guilty clients, negotiate plea deals for the unrepentant, argue technicalities that freed people who absolutely committed the crimes they were charged with. The detachment wasn't a flaw in those moments, it was necessary, essential, the only way to function in a system built on competing truths and imperfect choices. But this time, the detachment felt different, heavier, like I was calculating the weight of souls instead of legal strategies. Judge Robinson's voice cut through my internal spiral. "Anything further from counsel?" Marcus Chen shook his head, already packing his folder. I was already standing, my hand on Anthony's shoulder, half reassurance, half warning. "No, Your Honor, nothing further." I caught him near the vending machines on the third floor, away from the security cameras that monitored the main corridors. He was reaching for his wallet when I said his name, or rather, the name I'd seen on the court officer's clipboard when he'd signed in. Davies. He turned with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years controlling his reactions. His hand didn't move towards anything defensive, his expression didn't shift beyond mild curiosity, but his eyes sharpened, cataloging me. The briefcase, the suit, the courthouse badge clipped to my lapel. "Counselor," he said neutrally. I kept 2 feet of distance between us, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to maintain professional boundaries. "Someone in that courtroom knows you." The words landed like a diagnosis, terminal, immediate. For 3 seconds, Davies didn't move, didn't blink. The vending machine behind him hummed, fluorescent lights reflected off its glass front. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed with bureaucratic finality. Then his shoulders dropped, perhaps an inch. Not defeat, recalibration. "Who?" he said. Not a question, a demand stripped from everything except necessity. "Anthony Reeves, my client, the assault case Judge Robinson just modified bail on." Davies' jaw tightened. He was already running calculations that mirrored mine from 15 minutes ago. Exposure vectors, containment options, timeline until compromise became catastrophic. "What did he say?" "That you're not who you claim to be, that you were asking questions after an incident at McCarthy's in Canarsie, that you knew details only people present would know." I watched his face for confirmation and found it in the microscopic tension around his eyes. "He hasn't told anyone else yet." "Yet," Davies repeated, tasting the word's implications. "I'm violating privilege by being here," I said, my voice surgical in its precision. "So understand this isn't a negotiation. It's a warning. One time, no follow-up, no contact. You take whatever action you need to take, and I never see you again." Davies studied me for a long moment, and I wondered what he saw. A lawyer breaking her oath, a woman making an impossible choice, someone trying to prevent a death without causing another. "Your client," he said carefully, "does he understand the danger?" I told him to keep his mouth shut, but I can't control what he does outside my office. I paused. "Neither can you, not without making things worse." Davies nodded once, the movement economical and final. We both knew what worse meant. We both knew time was already running out. Not in days, maybe not even in hours. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods like Canarsie. faster when it carried the weight of blood. "Thank you," he said quietly. I didn't respond. There was nothing to thank me for. I'd simply chosen which damage to prevent. I walked away without looking back. Marcus Chen was still in the building. I found him near the prosecutor's wing, reviewing notes with a paralegal. When I asked for 2 minutes of his time, he followed me to an empty conference room with the wariness of someone expecting another argument. "There's a secondary warrant," he said, without preamble. "Outstanding. From Queens. Traffic violation that escalated failure to appear on a bench warrant from 2 years ago." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "For Reeves?" "Check the system. Anthony James Reeves, DOB, March 15th, 1989. It's there, small enough that it got lost in the shuffle of the assault charge, but it's active." I kept my voice level, transactional. "You execute him now, he gets processed, sits overnight, arraigned tomorrow morning. I waive time, we handle it clean." "Why would you want me to arrest your client after we just modified his bail?" "Because that warrant is a ticking bomb, and I'd rather it detonate in controlled circumstances." I held his gaze. "You pick him up now in the courthouse, surrounded by officers and cameras, or he gets pulled over next week in Canarsie at 2 in the morning, and who knows what happens when he panics." Marcus studied me, calculating angles I couldn't let him see. Finally, he nodded. "Give me 10 minutes to confirm." It took 8. The officers approached Anthony while he was still in the corridor, riding the high of our victory, texting someone, probably his mother, about the modified bail. Officer Rodriguez led the approach, her voice professionally neutral as she spoke his full name, his date of birth, and asked him to confirm his identity. Anthony's confusion bloomed slowly, like watching someone realize they'd been cut and not yet feeling the pain. "What's going on?" He looked past Rodriguez to me, standing 5 feet back, my briefcase in hand. "Sarah?" "Mr. Reeves, you have an outstanding warrant from Queens County for failure to appear," Rodriguez said, already moving to position him for cuffing. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." "What? No, we just—" Anthony's confusion crystallized into comprehension, then rage. His eyes locked on mine with an intensity that felt physical. "You said I was free." The other officers had moved closer, ready for resistance. The corridor had gone quiet, other lawyers and defendants watching the scene with the detached interest of people grateful it wasn't happening to them. "I said we won," I replied, my voice carrying just far enough for Anthony to hear. "I never said free." The handcuffs clicked into place with mechanical precision. Rodriguez began the familiar recitation of rights that Anthony had heard before, would hear again. He didn't resist. His body had gone rigid with betrayal instead of fight. As they led him toward the detention area, Anthony looked back once, not with anger anymore, with the dawning understanding that he'd been protected from something he didn't yet comprehend. The courtroom had already emptied. Judge Robinson had moved on to the next case. No one would know why Anthony Reeves, whose bail had just been modified in his favor, was suddenly back in custody. No one except the people who needed to know. 3 weeks later, Anthony walked out of Queens County Detention with charges reduced to time served on the warrant and a plea deal with the assault case that kept his electrician's license intact. The media never covered it. No courtroom drama, no closing arguments that would make law school textbooks. Just paperwork processed efficiently, a judge's signature, and a man returning to his daughter's crayon drawings. I wasn't there when he was released. I had already handed his file to another attorney in the firm, citing scheduling conflicts that were technically true but fundamentally dishonest. 6 weeks after that, I saw a brief mention in the Daily News of a major organized crime bust in Canarsie, 17 arrests, racketeering charges that would take years to prosecute. No names of undercover officers were mentioned, of course. They never were. But I recognized the bar, McCarthy's. I recognized the timeline. Davies's operation had continued, Whatever he'd been building survived Anthony's recognition, survived my intervention, survived the precarious 48 hours when everything could have collapsed into violence. I thought about that often in the months that followed, how easily lives shifted on decisions measured in minutes, how Anthony's freedom had cost him one night in detention and possibly saved his life, how warning Davies violated every principle of attorney-client privilege but prevented a murder, how the system I'd learned to navigate worked exactly as designed and completely failed at the same time. The Bar Association never investigated. No one filed a complaint. Marcus Chen never asked why I pushed for Anthony's arrest so aggressively, and if he suspected something beneath the surface, he was professional enough not to pursue it. But I knew. Every time I walked into a courtroom after that, I felt the weight of that choice, the moment I'd stopped being just an advocate and become something else. Something that made calculations about whose life mattered more in equations that had no right answers. I left criminal law 6 months later, switched to contract work, corporate negotiations, disputes that ended in settlements instead of sentences. My colleagues assumed I'd burned out, that the grind of defending the guilty had finally worn through my resolve. They were wrong. I didn't leave because I couldn't defend guilty clients. I left because I discovered I was willing to manipulate the system to save them, and that willingness terrified me more than any verdict ever could. Sometimes I still see Anthony's face, that moment in the corridor when the handcuffs closed and he looked at me with betrayal turning to comprehension. I wonder if he ever figured out what I'd actually done. If he understood that the arrest I orchestrated wasn't punishment, but protection. I wonder if it matters. Justice survived that day in the courthouse. The case was resolved, the operation continued, no one died. But something in me didn't survive. The part that believed in clean lines between right and wrong, between advocacy and intervention, between defending a client and playing God with their fate. I made the right choice. I'm certain of that. I just can't live with what it costs to make it. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. Have a wonderful day.